Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and today I am so happy to have Denne Michele Norris with us. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She's the editor-in-chief of Electric Literature, winner of the Whiting Literary Magazine Prize. She is the first Black, openly trans woman to helm a major literary publication. She co-hosts the critically acclaimed podcast Food for Thought, THOT, and holds an MFA from Sarah Lawrence College. Welcome, Denne.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting.
So we first met at the Open Secrets Live conference where we were both on different panels, but I think we met in like that green room-ish place downstairs. So when you told me about your book, I read it, I devoured it. First of all, I love the title.
Thank
And I
you.
want to talk about that. I'm like kind of a title queen, so I love the title, When the Harvest Comes. That's just such a great title for a novel. Can you describe in your words what the book is about? And then we'll get into some more of the specifics.
Yeah, so, it's a novel and it's really about a queer love story that sort of feels very enchanted, but the characters encounter some family drama, some trauma that happens in the wake of one of their fathers being in a terrible car accident, which happens on the day of the wedding. And so as they're processing that, as they're moving through grief, there are some challenges that really show up in this relationship. And the two main characters, Davis and Everett, have to find their way back to each other and find their way to their sort of deepest, truest selves.
Yeah, there's so many things that you did in the craft of this novel that I thought was fascinating. First of all, we're not used to really reading about a femme presenting gay man coupled with, somebody who's of a different ethnicity. So it's a Black man with a white man and who's very masculine presenting. And I thought that dichotomy was so fascinating. As we know, with writers, everything is choices. So can
Mhm.
you talk about making those choices?
Oh, yes. So that choice is something that came very early in the process. In its earliest forms, I was really interested in looking at two characters who would deal with grief very, very differently. And just from various experiences in my own life, I was thinking in an almost humorous way about like when I've gone to Black funerals and when I've gone to white funerals and the difference in how they work, how they operate, how people behave at them. And that sort of influenced my thinking around the ideas that these two characters might encounter loss in this novel, and that one character might not know how best to support the other character. But I was not interested in a story where that necessarily meant the end of the relationship. I was interested in this idea of just trying to do your best and trying to figure it out as you go along. But I was very, very interested in every aspect of this book and in every aspect of their relationship of creating real contrast, real difference, like two people who just irrevocably love each other, but are so different in every single way and are navigating life with those differences.
That's really so important that they're navigating it in different ways with their different character flaws, strengths, everything. And to me, it's so interesting that there's so many elements of change taking place throughout the novel. Every character is basically in a different place at the end than from the beginning. So we know that conflict drama is such a key part. Otherwise, it's just like a fun little anecdote and, why does it make a book? So
Mhm.
what to you made it a craft decision to build in the conflict in each character? And how did you go about dealing with that through each chapter to evolve the arc?
That is such a good question. And I'll say, it took a long time. This novel took me from writing the first words to publication. That was 14 years, about 10 years sort of drafting, and then sort of 2.5 years or so after selling it and doing editing and all of that. And so I had a lot of time. I wasn't intending to take so much time, but I did end up taking a lot of time. And I think that there were a few things that were a part of it. One, I learned early on that I had to continue to ratchet up the drama. I initially conceived of this as sort of like a Jumpalahiri-esque, like long short story. And when I first started writing it, for example, Davis and Everett were moving in together when all of this happened. And as I realized it was a book, a few years later was like, I don't think that's enough. I need to really make the reader understand how in love they are and how committed they are to each other. I was like, okay, let's have them get married. And once I realized that, I said I should have them get married because, weddings always have drama and intrigue, and there's so many people that are involved in it, and there's so many feelings. Like everyone at a wedding, I feel like is sort of a raw nerve. And so that just gave me a lot of material to work with. And it gave me a framing device sort of for the first part of the book. But when it comes to the characters and the fact that all of the characters change, which is such a huge compliment, and thank you for that, because that is very important to me, I'm simply not interested in writing characters who are drawn thinly in the context of a book. Like I have characters who are in the forefront of the book and I have characters who are in the background of the book, but they're all real characters. And something that I kept thinking that I really never heard anyone say until the actress Kerry Washington published her own memoir, and this is something she talked about on her book tour, is that she said, every person is the main character in their own life. I had been thinking that for years, but I had never heard it quite phrased in that way. I had never heard it talked about in that way, but it was so concise. And for me, I was already, I think, mostly done with the book by the time that book came out. But I was like, that's what I was always trying to do. I was always trying to make every character, when they were on the page, feel to the reader that they were still moving through the world with their own life at the center of their story, even though they might be the sister of the main character, they might be the parent of one of the main characters, they might be at those characters' weddings. Like they have their own things going on. And those things are never completely out of mind, even when you're attending to the needs and the events of other people that you love. And so that was just super, super, super important to me.
I love that. Did you show those changes through dialogue, through action? What were the choices on how to show the changes as they evolved? I mean, you even had, objects that had significance, clothing, music, and we'll talk more about the music. I'm a musician as well, so
Oh my gosh, yes. I had great fun writing about music. But in terms of those changes, I don't know that I made conscious decisions as I was writing about how to show it, other than through the events of the novel and through how the characters were relating to each other. I'm very much, for better or worse, I think for better, but you never know, but for better or worse, I am very much a character first fiction writer. And so I'm always thinking about the characters and their relationships. And so for me, objects, Things like that were things that happened to sort of work within the book that I felt like I discovered a lot of times. When it came to dialogue, that was just one of the tools that I can use to show how the characters are relating to each other, how they're interacting. And I also think with dialogue, it's such an interesting tool because with dialogue, when you put that in there, you can be external from a character. You can even be in a different character's point of view, and still the reader can learn something about the character that's speaking. The different characters can learn different things about each other through what they're saying. And the implicit thing about dialogue that I love so much is that when you're dealing with dialogue, you've got what is being said, and then you've got what's not being said. And with both of those dynamics, you have what readers are cognizant of and what characters may or may not be cognizant of. And you can really play around with who knows what, right? So, this idea that a reader might be aware of something that a character hasn't quite realized or figured out, which I play around with a lot in this book, I think, in sort of big and small ways. All of that I can use and sort of manipulate to give a character arc.
Yeah, it's like the hidden subtext, right? Like there's somebody saying something, but you know that they just had this flashback of, Davis dealing with his father. And so that informs whatever they're saying now. But the reader knows that, but the character's not referring to it at the moment. So it's kind of like you have to be an investigator as the reader, which I think involves you more with the story. It's not just
Yes.
everything is being told to you, although enough is being told. Now, what I found really fascinating about this book is I'm like diving into it. I'm like, when the harvest comes, that sounds like spiritual. And then we start with a spicy, very, very spicy sex scene. And I'm like, damn.
Quite a few people have talked to me about that sex scene, and quite a few people have been like, I did not know that was coming.
I'll just say the first two sentences. Davis Josiah Freeman is perfectly safe. He lies flat on his back, legs spread, ankles in the air, sweating from the heat of Everett's body on top of his. Okay, this is clearly a love affair. So it's like sex in the context of this deep, deep connection. It's not like he picked him up at a bar. And in fact, they have such a good meet cute, but we don't hear about it until way later in the book, which I appreciate because you're building on the strength of the current relationship at the moment. But tell me about this spicy decision.
Well, it's so funny. So sex plays a pretty important role in the book and in the relationship. And from its earliest embers, this is what I was thinking of. The conflict that arises in this book between them sexually is the conflict that I was thinking of. And that's also actually part of where I was thinking about, by the way, the contrast between the two characters. I started this book in 2011, and at that time, I really wanted to center a character who very often in gay and queer spaces is not considered desirable, is not considered sexy. And I wanted to put his heart in the hands of the type of man that in those spaces was the prize that everyone would want. And then I wanted to upend those power dynamics, which I did, I think, over the course of the novel. And so with the spiciness, with the sexy scenes and that being a part of the story, I first, it was in writing this project in the very early days of writing it that I wrote my first sex scenes, and that I was sort of pushed into it by one of my professors who was like, well, you've got to be able to write sex scenes if this is what you're going to do. And so she like pushed me into doing it, and it turned out that came fairly naturally to me, which I think is interesting. But I always knew it was going to be front and center in this narrative, and that it was going to be one of the tools that a reader had to sort of see how these characters are evolving in real time. But I will tell you, it was a very interesting thing. I'm part of a queer writing group with some fabulous writers, Meredith Toulousan, Tori Peters, Garrett Conley, to name a few of them. And I had shown them the book, and they were saying that initially, for years, I had the first scene of the book as the scene where the Reverend wakes up in his car accident, and the second scene was the sex scene. And if you go out and read the book, you'll see that I switched it up. And so when I sent the book to my agent, because we were about to send it out to publishers, I sent it to him, and I put the sex scene first on the advice of my writing group. And I had a call with my agent and we were talking. I said, well, what did you think about this, the way that I switched the two scenes? And he was like, I thought it might be a little bit too much, but I wasn't sure. But my assistant thought the same thing. What did you think? And I said, I also thought it might be too much. Let's switch it back. And so when the novel went out on submission to various editors and publishers, we had the accident scene first and the sex scene second. Then the book is bought and sold and all of that. And I have my first editorial call with my editor, who's a young woman from Random House. And not the person I initially would have thought would have suggested this, but the first thing she says in our call is, oh, you're going to switch those two scenes, right? You're going to put the sex scene first. And I was shocked. And I had to tell her, it's so funny. My agent and I didn't think that editors would be able to take that. We thought that might scare them off. And now you're saying the first thing you're telling me to do is do this thing that we had already done. I just thought it was so funny. And I knew it was meant to be.
That's really interesting because the way that you have it now centers the scene in Davis and Everett. And when you have the Reverend part, it's really the Reverend and his perspective and all the bystanders with what's happening with him.
Yeah.
So I see that in a way. I mean, it's a shocking thing, but it's also grounding in a way. And then you go back to other sex scenes throughout to the point where the conflict happens and all that. This is very much a book about grief, about loss, of owning parts of yourself without giving everything away. And so it's like this journey back to yourself. And part of that is the relationship with the Reverend, which you talk about, especially towards the end. Now, when I'm looking at the book, I look at every page, including the acknowledgments. So there you go. For my father, Reverend Dr. Dennis Earl Norris. And I'm like, okay. So how much of this book is autobiography?
That is a good question, and it's really interesting. My feeling is that it's less autobiographical than I think people will think. Parts of my life that I stole for the writing of the book, but this is really interesting. My own father, who was a minister, passed away in the first semester of my MFA program at Sarah Lawrence, and I took a month off. I came back to school. I did the year. I wrote short stories. I got good feedback on them, but something was sort of missing. And I really left the program feeling like I had possibly made a mistake and that I should just throw in the towel on this writing thing and go to law school. And over the summer, I came up with an idea. I went to two workshops and I came up with an idea sort of in the space of those workshops, which was to try and write a project that was so true to my life, that was so autobiographical, that I could take every bit of energy that I was putting into convincing a reader of authenticity and instead put it into the emotional heart of the writing. And this is because I would write these stories and then I would revise them enough to get the grade, but I would then abandon them and move on to a new story. And I understood, I said, I will never write something that's publishable, that's really worth a reader's time, if I can't find the wherewithal to go back and keep digging and keep working. And so this was the idea that I came up with. And so then I came up with an idea that is related to this idea, but is a little bit different. And it took hold of me and I just kept working on it. And my theory is that there's two kinds of fiction writers, that there's fiction writers who start very close to their personal experience and then write away from it. Because ultimately, all of the choices that I have to make have to be in service of the story, not in service of me or my life or the people around me. And there's writers who start very far away from their personal experience and they end up writing towards it, and everyone sort of ends up somewhere in the middle. And so with this novel, it's true, for example, that I'm Black and queer and femme and trans. It's true that my father was a minister. It's true that I grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio. And it's true that I played the viola. It's also, I've never been married or even been close to being married. I didn't grow up in Chagrin Falls, which I think is an important distinction if you know the Midwest. And so there's lots of things about it that are very, very different from my life, sort of obviously and on the face. I have way more siblings than this character has and a much bigger family. My mother was still living. She passed recently. And so there's all these differences, but I do think that on the face of it, it looks very autobiographical, but it's not. But I'll give one more little tidbit to that. A big part of the conflict that happens between Everett and Davis is that Davis is estranged from his father. So his life happens outside of his father's purview, his life as an adult. And when his father dies, he feels like his father's in heaven and can see him. And that creates the conflict between him and Davis. When I was a kid, and my grandparents died, people in the church died, I was kept awake at night by my fears that because they were in heaven, they knew the things that I was thinking and feeling, and that I couldn't tell anyone, or that I was afraid to tell anyone. And I was like, oh my God, they know. Like, they know that I have a crush on the boy sitting next to me in sixth grade English. And so I remembered that in the wake of the loss of my own father. And that's kind of where the book like grew from. So that is very autobiographical, but what grew from it is like mostly artistic conjecture.
I love the idea of taking your emotions and imbuing that into the work to keep you going. And so it's a part of you, but it's not all of you. I want to talk about Everett for a moment. So I grew up reading all these love stories, Sweet Savage Love, and all these romance ones where the men were like ultra masculine. They would sit spread eagle. They were the cowboy type. And that was the epitome of masculinity. Forget how they actually treated the women, but it was like this trope of masculinity. And I was surprised that Everett, although he treats Davis very reverently, he has that masculine, you could just pluck him out of a romance novel, and the only difference is he loves this femme gay guy.
Yeah, it was fun to dive into that world. And I grew up in the Midwest, as I mentioned, but listen, I went to a private all boys school for high school in a place called Hunting Valley, Ohio, which I feel like is a good characterization for what I grew up around. And then I went to, a small liberal arts college in Philly, and then I went to Sarah Lawrence, and I was around plenty of sort of East Coast white people, very liberal with money. And so I understood that world very, very well. And in terms of Everett's masculinity, it really, again, very, very early, I just wanted to give the Black gay femme character the love story where they're the one that has the power to potentially challenge the relationship, end the relationship. I didn't want to write a book where that character would be like, I'm so lucky to have this like big, strong white man who loves me and protects me. Like, I wanted Davis to almost not even be aware of that dynamic or be thinking about that dynamic, but I wanted to set that dynamic in place almost entirely because I just wanted to upend it. I wanted to tell a different kind of love story in that way. I wanted to give that character the romance that I felt like they deserved that they don't always get in real life. And that part wasn't so racial. And part of why I decided that Everett had to be white was because I felt like if that character was a Black man, if that character was an Asian man, if that character was a Latina man, what Davis is going through with his father in the wake of the loss of his father, I felt like men of color were more likely to understand and sympathize. And I needed that conflict to really rise to the surface. And I felt like if I had Everett be a white man who came from a liberal family, and yes, there were his family, they had their own issues of acceptance earlier in his life, but if he was the kind of man who moved through the world truly feeling that everything was for him, and then his partner, who he loves so dearly, is like pulling away from him and is cutting off access to him, sort of emotionally and physically, that might really disturb him and really challenge him. And I was very interested in that idea, in Davis taking away some of Everett's power unintentionally, just by restricting him, but taking that away and in some ways bringing him to his knees. That was very, very interesting to me.
I want to talk about the music because, well, so I grew up singing opera, studying opera,
Oh my gosh, amazing.
mezzo soprano. So I understand really well about music. And you talk about Davis is a wonderful viola player. He's like a concert level, on the up. And you talk about music and you talk about the structure of the viola, and it has like flaws in it and it's very hard. And it's a metaphor for the actual transformation that's going on within the character. Can you speak to that?
Well, it's so funny because I will say that I always knew from day one that Davis was going to be a musician. And I know string instruments very well. As I mentioned, I played viola growing up and I played it to, a very high level. I used to go away to chamber music camp for 6 weeks in the summer. I was always first chair of the orchestra throughout my schooling and played in youth orchestras and competitions and all these different things. And for a long time, I wanted to be a professional violist. When I went to college, I kind of realized that wasn't quite the path that I wanted to take. But anyway, I understood very early on that Davis was going to be a musician because early on in the earliest drafts, also it was going to be the kind of thing where Everett made a lot of money in finance or I mean, I thought at one point he might be a lawyer, but he was always going to like make a lot of money and come from money, and Davis was going to be making no money and just be sort of a recent music school grad trying to figure out his life. And I quickly sort of tired of that dynamic, and I became more interested in the idea that Davis is actually a rising star and is doing quite well as a musician and is making his own money and doesn't need Everett to pay his bills. And then I was like, okay, in some ways I'm taking money sort of off the table as an area of conflict in this novel, which was, I think, an interesting choice, but what felt like it was the right one for this book. The point is, early on, I thought Davis would be a cellist and he would have stopped playing the cello. And I thought that because I think cello is just such a mournful instrument, the sound of it. And like, I always kind of wanted to play cello and I never did. And so I was like, oh, I'll have fun with that. And when I decided that Davis needed to be a star, I was like, well, the violinists are usually the stars. Let's just make him a violinist. He's sort of physically small anyway. And I always also loved the violin, and I can write about all these different violin concertos that I've never played that I like love. But I had never had any interest in making Davis a violist because I was like, that's going to be too close to my life. Like that's closer to my life than I'm comfortable with. And then towards the end of the process, after I'd finished it took me a long time to write a first draft. And after I finished that first draft, and I was going back and rewriting things, I was like, I realized I think I need to make Davis a violist. And I started thinking back on my experience. And the first thing I thought of was something I'd always noticed, which is that in all the music schools I went to and all the youth orchestras and all the places, almost the only time I saw Black people playing a stringed instrument, they were playing the viola. And I thought that was interesting, given how sort of maligned the viola can be in the context of the string instruments. And then as I started thinking about the sort of inherent flaws of the viola and how for its acoustic range, its ideal size is impossible for a human to play. And so different luthiers have tried to come up with different ways of accommodating that. I can tell you it really does present very specific challenges. And so the technique that you have to use to play the viola well is different from the violin. And so, like, when I listen to violists, I can usually tell if a violist started on violin or if they always played the viola based on certain aspects of the sound. Not always as much now, but I used to be able to tell that really, really closely. And so I just realized towards the end, I said, I was just like, once I put that together in my head, I was like, oh, I have to make Davis a violist. And I'm just going to have to do that. And it's a minor sort of thing in some ways, but it was again a moment where it was like, it doesn't matter. That's very close to my lived experience, perhaps in ways that I'm not totally comfortable with. That's the right decision for this book. And so I have to make that choice.
So there are a couple of things I want to ask about. You break it into three parts. What was the decision on doing it that way?
That came late in the game. I vacillated between having as many as 4 parts, I think, and having as few as two. And my editor saw it all of these ways because when I sold it, I think we had it in 4 parts. And then when I handed in my first round of edits after I sold the book, I think I had it in 2 parts. And then we settled on 3 parts in the next round. And it just fell into place. My biggest challenge, I don't write in order. I don't write from beginning to end ever. And I'm always moving around in time in my narratives. And so what that means is that I have to spend a lot of time just like getting everything out. And then I figure out where things are placed and how the narrative shape is going to emerge. And so, because of that, it was towards the end that it just fell into place. As I was putting it together, I was like, oh, these are the clear sort of markers, and this is where I can end part one and part two. But it moved around. There are just so many machinations of it that are on my computer where different things were in different places. And it was more about the narrative and figuring out what I needed to give readers to hold on to at the beginning so that I could help shape what they would value as they read through the book. and what they would be clued into. That was just how we figured out the narrative, and the breaks just fell into place.
That makes sense. I was looking before for the description of the difference between the viola and the violin, and I found it on 216. I'm just going to read this little paragraph. People assume the technique for playing the viola and the violin is the same, but it's not at all. It's very different. The viola is bigger and heavier. The strings are thicker. It's slower to respond, as I said, and so it requires a different approach physically. There are places on most violas where the player will have a hard time getting a clean, resonant note out of the instrument. And when I work with students, I can usually tell by their playing if they started on viola or if they started on violin and then switched over at some point, just by how they play, how they produce sound. There's a difficulty there. And the character of Davis, he's not an easy character. He's a little high strung. So that plays into it. And it plays into even more later on with how the arc continues to grow with the characters. I just thought it was really fascinating. How did you come up with the title, Jen?
Well, I can tell you too about the end. So the title came to me about 3 or 4 years into the process, I guess early enough in the process, but I'd had two other titles that I had sort of been working with, neither of which I was committed to. I just sort of trusted the title would come to me in the right moment. And so this is what happened. I was home in 2014 or maybe 2015. I just started rewriting the novel completely because I had read a book that made me realize that I needed to just rewrite everything. And it was Thanksgiving, and my sister and I were cleaning off the dining room table, which is where my dad often used to work. He would write sermons, he would do all kinds of things at the dining room table. He'd sit there and pay bills. Never mind the fact that he had a whole room that was his office in the house. Like that was where he did his work. And so we were clearing everything off, and he had passed away 3 years before. And in the clearing off, I found a draft of a sermon that he had written. And I suspect that it's the sermon that he was writing when he had the stroke that killed him, but I'm not 100% sure, but it looks like it. The title of that sermon was When the Harvest Comes. And so immediately I said, oh, I said, that's the title. And I thought to myself, I said, that title is so good because this is still early stages of this book that I was like, I will write towards that title. I will write towards that title if I need to, because I think that metaphor works, but I'll write towards it if I need to. And not that I was terribly conscious of it, but I will say that up until the very end of writing it before we sold it, I had not ever really referenced the title in a strong way in the narrative. I'd had a scene that I think ended up being cut that sort of replays that biblical story, but I didn't have a clear connection until the moment at the end. And that I wrote that at the very end of the process. That was a moment that I avoided writing for many years, even though I knew I needed to write it because it was going to be emotionally difficult for me. And I sort of prepared, and I was like, you're going to write this and you're going to write this in one take because it's going to be too much to live in it. And so I wrote it. And as I was writing it, it just came, and I was like, oh, and I can put that phrase right here and bring everything together. And it just happened.
I thought that was really artfully done. What do you want people to most take away from reading your novel?
Honestly, mostly I want it to be an escape for people. I want it to be a story that brings people hope, that reminds people about love, that reminds people about loving each other across our differences, whether they're differences in identity, whether they're differences in lived experience, whether they're differences in sort of even political ideas to an extent. I want it to just be honestly a hopeful place and a safe place for people to escape to. And I think in this time that we're living in, so many readers need something that's going to take them out of this world and bring them into a better world. And I very much believe in the idea that part of our job as artists is that we can create the world on the page that we want to live in and that we want our people to live in. And there was a recent study that came out that showed sort of record low numbers of Americans that are actually reading for pleasure, reading for entertainment. And I was interviewed about this, and one of the things that I said is that like you can tell. Like when I hear what's happening on the news, when I hear what people who are leading this country, leading this government right now, the things that they're saying and the things that they're doing, these are not people who read. These are not people who are engaging in the kinds of activities that create and inspire empathy, that allow them to even think about the world from another person's point of view. It's extremely limiting. And so it's as important as it's ever been that we continue to put work in the world that gives that to people. And sometimes it may only get to like our own people, the people that agree with us, that move through the world with us, but they need that escape too. Like other Black, queer, femme people need to escape from this news cycle and need to read something where they see someone who looks like them, who identifies like them, who is loved and who is protected, fiercely so. And also, everyone else, they need that escape too. And so I just hope that people are able to get wrapped up in it and get away from all of this that we're living in for a few hours.
Beautiful thought there. Thank you so much. This was such a great discussion. Everybody, when the harvest comes, Denne Michele Norris.
Thank you.
Follow me at estelleserasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.